We acknowledge the original owners of the land on which we podcast, whose stories were told for thousands of years. Today, we are recording in Meanjin. We pay our respects to elders past and present who may be listening. Sovereignty was never ceded. A quick note before we get started that there may be some swearing in today's podcast. If you don't like swearing or usually listen with children in the car, you have been warned. You're listening to What in the NDIS Now, a podcast where I, Hannah Redford, and my friend Sam Rosenbaum interview participants and providers about all things NDIS. This episode of What in the NDIS Now is brought to you by Astalty. Astalty is the software solution for NDIS professionals built by NDIS professionals. Astalty is my go-to software, and Astalty is trusted and loved by hundreds of other NDIS providers. I love how easy it is to use and how it keeps all my participant information, notes, and invoicing all in one place, available to me anytime from any device. Sign up now for your 14-day free trial. Head to astalty.com.au to sign up now. See for yourself how much easier managing all your NDIS business needs are by using Astalty. Thanks again to Astalty for sponsoring today's episode. Hi Sam, how are you going?
Yeah, going well, Hannah. Yourself?
I'm doing really well. Today on the podcast, we have Esther. Welcome to the podcast. Esther?
Hi, thanks for having me.
So our first question, as always, is where did you grow up?
Yeah, I grew up in Aotearoa, Auckland, New Zealand, on the North Shore near the beach. And then, that's where I lived for a lot of my life. Moved to Onehunga as a young adult and then to Australia in 2017.
And what brought you to Australia?
I came to Australia to work for the person that I have returned to working for now, actually. I happened to bump into someone at a conference and they asked me if I liked my job when I was standing right next to my boss at the time, which was pretty awkward. I managed to kind of ramble through a response and make some plans to get lunch and had an interview, and 5 weeks later kind of landed in Australia with 4 bags and 2 cats and a very supportive partner, and here we are.
Oh, awesome. We have had a lot of New Zealanders on the podcast. Sam, I'm starting to feel outnumbered.
Well, look, we're from south of the border, so...
That's true.
It's just a migrational podcast, let's just face it.
Yeah. Fair.
But we're all, but most of us have ended up in Queensland, which is a wonderful little state.
So how did you get into the disability sector?
So I'd worked with children and young people for a long time, I don't know, 10 and a bit years. And then, in moving over to Australia, I started working specifically as the behaviour support practitioner. At first actually in out-of-home care, so not necessarily, the same, although there's some overlap. And then when I moved up to Queensland, also didn't come directly to Queensland. When I moved up to Queensland, then I started working, predominantly with, NDIS participants. So that would have been around the rollout, I guess, around 2018.
Yep. Awesome.
Yep.
So you are a behaviour support practitioner.
Yep.
What exactly is or does a behaviour support practitioner do?
I mean, what exactly does a support coordinator do? You answer my question, I'll answer yours. No, I mean, like your role, like I've heard you talk about how kind of complex and how it can feel like it changes, not only from person to person, but also over time, or as the NDIS is something different or something new, like a lot can change. So the way that you support a 4-year-old who's learning how to communicate what they want. It's just so drastically different from the way you'd support an adult who, has experiences of trauma and who has survived really difficult environments, and had a lot of kind of those really like power dynamics and a lot of kind of, really oppressive experiences, and then the way you'd support that person is again so different from the way you'd support someone, with early onset dementia who's trying to maintain their kind of quality of life in the face of, by definition, a regressive condition, so it's really difficult to define, and that's made even more difficult because the field itself is made up of social workers and teachers and occupational therapists and psychologists and people, with a really big significant background in supporting people with disabilities and a degree, but not necessarily one of those like allied health, or developmental educators. So the way that I would refine it down is like helping people have good days. And it really sounds a bit oversimplistic, but I guess that's kind of the compass bearing, And then there's plenty of stuff around that as well, right? So we're going to write a positive behavior support plan. If there are NDIS providers involved, then, I view part of my role as kind of doing the things that I need to do so that not only I'm compliant, but also they're compliant and supporting that. So yeah, it can change a lot, but I guess when I distill it down, it's just trying to help people have good days and navigate this really complex world and often really complex situations that they're in, if that
It
answers.
definitely is a complex space, and it's, as you said earlier, it's an ever-changing world, like support coordination can be. How is some of the more recent hot topics coming out of the DRC and then also the NDIS review, and then what the NDIS actually perceives as the role? And then also we've got state-based legislation for each area as well, which adds another level of complexity.
Yeah, and don't get me started. I think the first thing I ever heard you say on a podcast was how much you like legislation. I thought, okay, how are we going to get along? Yeah, look, there's a few questions in there. So the recent events and then the state-based thing, I think here in Queensland, I think I was on leave when they did some public consultation trying to update the Disability Services Act to, kind of more align with a national approach. And so that's something that's in the works at the moment, but it can come into conflict. There's been times when I've spoken with, pretty senior people in the department, the Queensland State Department and the NDIS saying, what's the go here? Like, who would actually be the most appropriate person to authorize this plan with restrictive practices? And no one. There's this legislative loophole that we're in at the moment. Not loophole, sorry. This legislative gap that we're in at the moment, and we don't know. So it can get really difficult. And so it just can be difficult to navigate and make sure that people are compliant with all of these things. And it can put us in a difficult position sometimes saying, hey, if you want to keep doing what you're doing, all right, but I'm going to tell you right now that my understanding of the legislation is that if this is occurring, then this needs to happen. But it can.
Because that sort of is a key part of your role as a behavioural support practitioner, is informing those that actually support the person on how to support the person better for that happy life or getting through a good day sort of thing. Because it's not actually your job to implement that plan, is it?
No, not really. I mean, so in early intervention with children, there can be a lot more actual direct sort of support time. There can be. And so I guess so that I don't spend our entire conversation with 80% of it being just me giving caveats of except here, except there. How about I just overall say, generally, when I'm going to talk about behavior support, I'll speak to the majority of my experience, which is supporting adults, so subject to the Disability Services Act as well as the NDIS, who can communicate in some way. And that's not to say that other groups aren't important or worth talking about, of course, but I'll speak to my experience, because then I can meaningfully say things without needing to say except for this. So
Yeah.
going forward from there, my job just generally is to, I guess, listen first, to what's going on, and listen to the person themselves. And that's something that I think is so powerful, and I really want to see more of, is asking the person, hey, what's going on for you? That some of my favorite cases, for which I'm no longer required in the best possible way. I've sat down with the person with their behavior support plan, or with their, the empty response plan, and said, hey, so when you're feeling upset, how do you want to be treated? And I've never gotten an unreasonable response yet to that. What's going on for you? What do you want people to be thinking? What do you want people to remember about you when you're feeling, XYZ? And so that's a big part of it, is kind of listening, and listening to the other people in the room of, hey, what are you concerned about? And then writing kind of a plan and saying, hey, look, let's, how's this? Asking people about the plan before ever kind of formalizing it. And then supporting people to implement that plan. And that's the gap that is can be really difficult, right? Of, you hear a lot of stories about, getting sent to this really long plan, and then, not that sits considered away in a filing cabinet or something, right? And that's what I really want to avoid. So
can you talk us through what is typically, and I use the word typically because I do know there's 1,000 caveats.
You can see me grimacing, yeah.
Right. What do you see typically in a behaviour support plan?
Yes. Okay, great question. So typically in a behaviour support plan, there is some information about a person. I always like to add a really blank cover page, so there isn't some document that says, your full name, date of birth, address, NDIS number, just sort of floating out there in the world. So I like to have a blank, or just I think I've got a kind of sunrise-ish, picture. And then there's some information about a person. And this can be where people make it a bit lost, because you don't need to give a life history. Well, I don't think you need to give a life history. To me, it's about the stuff that's really relevant to the current situation of, I'm a support worker. I have 20 minutes before my shift starts, because I'm lucky. What can I read that will just give me the best possible start to understanding, what's going on for this person? And so, if someone's medical situation results in a lot of like fatigue, then that's really important to understand from a behavioral perspective, right? But if it's sort of, what towns they lived in from 4 to 7, and then 9 to 11, it's less interesting. So basic kind of overview, and then it will jump into behaviors of concern, and which we can come back to. And then it will talk about, it will be some kind of assessment, a functional behavior assessment of saying, why do we think this is happening? What do we think is underlying this behavior? What is the reason for this? And then there, I like to add a section, like a formulation section, where I try to kind of tie that together to explain why, for this person in their situation, what we're seeing is actually rational, and now, of course, if it's harmful, like we want to, support people to be safe, but, from their perspective, right? So talk about, something we see a fair bit is someone's they're feeling overwhelmed while they're out, and they've kind of asked to go home, and if someone said, well, no, come on, the schedule is XYZ, or, hey, you're supported 1 to 3, mate, and the other 2 people want to stay, so they've got a right to community access too, right? I genuinely, so no, mate. And then, okay, well then maybe, we might see some, yelling or physical aggression or something like that. And to try to walk people through that of course we don't want this to happen. We want people to have good days, spend their day regulated with people they feel safe and comfortable with. But what we're seeing now kind of might make a bit of sense given the person's environment. So what can we then do about that? No, that's not always possible, but often it is. To try to, yeah. And so then you would see some strategies. So you would see some like environmental strategies and some other kind of proactive strategies. And there I basically always, the first thing I address is what kind of support style the person responds best to, how they want to be supported. And usually this will be from what I've asked them, what kind of support workers do you like? And then some other kind of strategies. And then there's a skill building section, which we can come back to because I have a bit to say about that. And then, I didn't realize this feels like a quiz. And then there should be a kind of an implementation section of whose jobs, what, a response plan. Sorry, yeah, there was something slightly important. There'll be a response plan of, hey, when, if this happens, this is what it might look like, and here's how best to support the person in the moment. And again, I really like writing those with people when I can. Yeah, and then some implementation responsibilities and maybe the restrictive practices if there are any. And that kind of covers it. And there shouldn't usually be any surprises in the behaviour support plan, right? It's just things we should have been talking about the whole time. We've been kind of collaborating with the participant and their family or their support team, whoever.
Absolutely. So that brings me to what sorts of things are restrictive practices? Now, not to give you like a quiz, but like
That's good to know.
what are some of the things you see frequently happen, or what are some of the restrictive practices you do sometimes end up having to implement? Yeah, that would, I think, would be helpful to start to explain to our audience exactly what a restrictive practice, what it means to have a restrictive practice, and the sorts of things that can be seen as a restrictive practice.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing I want to say is that when I talk about restrictive practices, I use the phrase restrictive practices in like a morally neutral way. Now, we have an obligation to reduce and eliminate the use of restrictive practices over time, quoting a few bits of legislation verbatim here. And so that's not to say that I think restrictive practices are good necessarily or bad. I don't want to put it in those terms, but restrictive practices, typically are in place to keep people safe because there are risks of significant harm. And so, doing restrictive practices is not a bad thing if it's necessary, right? In fact, not doing them when they're necessary would be, not safe. So I just want to say that right up front. And the reason for that is that what the NDIS has sort of asked us to consider restrictive practices, whether they're occurring in like disability, like accommodation settings, or in the home. And so that's, I think, something that can be quite stressful for families if they're feeling like kind of judged or regulated by the NDIS, and that is not the case. So right up front, I want to say that. So the NDIS would define them as any practices that restrict the freedom or movement of a person, but it goes into a lot more depth than that. So there is 5 categories of restrictive practice under the NDIS: seclusion, mechanical, physical, environmental, and chemical. And in Queensland, if there's any seclusion or containment, so that would be somebody being locked somewhere that their free access is not permitted or is implied to be not permitted. If they're alone, it's seclusion, and if they're with someone, it's containment. So if you're locking yourself in the house with someone and their free access is not available. That's containment. These restrictive practices in Queensland cannot be done by an NDIS behaviour support practitioner. They require multidisciplinary assessment. You have to go to the department, and I'm blanking on the acronym, so I'm just going to have faith that people know what I mean when I say that. And so they'll set that aside. So then we have mechanical, physical, environmental, and chemical.
So can I just
Yep.
butt in
Yeah.
and say,
Yeah.
I just want to clarify. So if I had a participant in a house and they were an absconding risk, and so we lock the door at night, so they can't just wander out, that would be a restrictive practice.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. So this is where it gets complicated. I don't know how we're going to have this whole conversation in the time we've got today. So there's a caveat for locked doors, gates, and windows. And so there, if it's purely because of a skill deficit, where there's concerns about somebody's road safety, somebody's ability to navigate the community, or if they're like vulnerable to abuse or exploitation in the community, then having locked doors, gates, and windows so they can't leave without detection, without anyone realizing, that's not considered the containment or seclusion, or I think a restrictive practice under the DSA. Yeah. And so
it's very complicated.
It's complicated. Yeah. Or if somebody wants their own front door locked, they can lock their own front door. Gosh, that's okay, right? Like it's really about, okay, so they can't leave undetected, but then if they're going to try to leave, someone realizes, are they allowed to leave with support? Or is it, no, you can't leave your house right now, right? And then it could veer into a restrictive practice. Yeah. So it's if it's in response to somebody's kind of skills or someone's behavior. But I mean, that gets a little bit complicated, right? As walking in front of a car, do you have to show that it's a skill deficit versus like self-injury kind of a situation? Too complicated, right? But these are the exceptions. And I want to add that when it's within the community norms, especially for people under 18, then it's also not viewed as a restrictive practice. So if you have baby gates for a 2-year-old, not a restrictive practice, obviously. If this baby gate's in place for a 16-year-old, you're going to ask, well, why? What are the risks that, we need to consider and support you through here? So then mechanical restraint is using some kind of thing to restrict someone's movement. So, tying someone up, you've probably gone the wrong direction with the way of supporting them, right?
Now, yeah, and this one's really interesting because there's also stuff like when you're talking about transportation and moving a participant to and from a location, and sometimes you need a 5-point harness in the car. And this is kind of gets really tricky as well. Where is it become a RP or does it not? And the explanation that we've got on the NDIS website relative to this actually doesn't make it easy in any way, shape, or form to untangle.
No, it's confusing, isn't it? So, like a wheelchair lap belt, if somebody's a fall risk, would not be a restrictive practice. A wheelchair lap belt, if someone tries to stand up and run away, would be a restrictive practice. The 5-point harness, if it's for postural support, not a restrictive practice. The 5-point harness, if it's to stop you trying to pull the hair of the driver, would be a restrictive practice. But they've made an exception for a seatbelt buckle cover. And look, oh my gosh, I think that if they called a seatbelt buckle cover a restrictive practice, that would cause immense difficulty for so many people because I've had so many situations in which the only providers available to a person are unregistered. And if unregistered providers can't implement restrictive practices. And so the choice is not to be safely supported in the community with a buckle cover by a registered provider or not. The choice for some of these participants, especially in underserved areas, is not have any community access because there's only unregistered providers available, have unregistered providers not use the buckle cover, which is not safe, or have unregistered providers use the buckle cover, and if that was defined as an RP, that would be a problem. So I think, but from the technical legalistic perspective, I kind of don't get why they've just randomly decided buckle covers, aren't an RP, but it harnesses, because it still restricts a person from being able to do something that, but it enables the safe transportation of the person. So yes, so those are probably the least common restrictive practices that we'd encounter. Then you have physical restraint, which is using a part of your body to, prevent the free movement of someone else's body. And that could be from, holding someone down, like we saw in, that footage, to, the only way to get out of a hair grab, right, is to sort of is to hold the person's hand in place to stop them pulling, right? And that is preventing their free movement, right? And so it can get pretty complicated where it's like self-defense. This is, this is, starting to really be restricting people's movement.
And this is where a lot of HR and work health and safety regulation really becomes quite in opposition to the framework that we have to work in here. So it's very hard for providers to work towards providing a safe environment with their staff, which is a key responsibility as employees, but also then providing safe and competent supports to the participant.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's where, things like how unauthorized use of restrictive practices are treated is really important, because if we say, oh my gosh, if you do an unauthorized restrictive practice, that's a huge bad thing. Is there a risk that managers are going to put pressure on their support workers and say, you never do that? And, through all these communications, right, the message can get distorted a little bit. And so if a person is about to walk onto a busy road, we want support workers to always know that they can grab that person, right? And so we have to be careful. But of course, unauthorized restrictive practices of, people are like locking away people's cookies because they think that you should only have 2 in an afternoon, and any more is bad for you. Like, wow, like there are some unauthorized restrictions going on that are just terrible and can fly in the face of human rights. And so that balance is difficult, right? Of saying, I guess making sure that, staff feel safe to, hey, look, if somebody's trying to, has a knife and is trying to attack you, then whatever you need to do to get out of there. If you need to lock yourself in a room, which is technically containment if the front door happens to be locked at the time and you've got the key, and it's fine. Just do, you have to stay safe. It's there's sort of these tensions that pull people.
But the idea of the behaviour support plan is that hopefully it doesn't escalate to that point where you are then locking yourself in a room or having to take the knife out of someone's hand, because what we're trying to do is see the behaviours coming and de-escalate them before it gets to that bit, which then brings me to my next question, is about how do you train support workers on the behaviour support plan?
Depends. So I think firstly, right, the idea is that you've spent time with the support worker listening to them about their day-to-day experiences. Now, if in the rarer cases participants have a very negative view of their support workers, I might do this a little less, but I still will sort of view the person as the expert in their own experience in life. And then the people who spend every day to them have really significant insight and expertise to offer. And if the participant loves their support workers, then it's really straightforward, because you can kind of just listen to what everyone says, when there's some tension, you kind of need to try to figure out what's going on in a little bit more of a strategic way. So the first thing is to have listened, right? Because I think it's pretty reasonable if someone doesn't really trust that you've got a good understanding of the day-to-day support of a person, that they're potentially less inclined to to listen, right? And so then you've got that established. I think that's just so important. So then, have a plan, and then ideally I'll get together with support workers, often in two groups, so someone can be on shift, and kind of talk through the plan and ask them to have all read it beforehand. And I try to make plans concise and as brief as possible while meeting all of my kind of clinical expectations and NDIS obligations. And then, go through and spend a lot of time again talking about the my assessment of what's going on with these behaviors, put in quotes, or concerns, and what's going on. And again, spending a bit of time in that kind of theory. And the thinking there is that if you focus on just the strategies, and someone veers off course because two human beings communicating with each other, we never get all of the information, right? So if they veer a little off course, it can kind of go anywhere. Whereas if you've kind of walked them through the underlying thinking, then even if they veer on a little bit on the technical side of the strategies, if they've understood the reason for the strategies, then I think my experience is I'll veer a lot less off course, and so spend a bit of time. I might do a few exercises and trying to get people to understand what's going on, I don't know, just get them feeling a little bit uncomfortable, like not in a horrible way, but just, hey, I know this person's been made to have, eye contact in the past, so there's been some forced or coerced eye contact in the past. Like, that's so unpleasant. Like, come on, pair up, just stare at each other in the eyes for 2 minutes. Like, how uncomfortable does this get quickly? And I don't get me wrong, I've only done that to like one team. And there was, don't worry, I don't want anyone thinking, oh my gosh, I never want training with Esther. But just some little kind of things like that. And then go into the strategies and really walk through them with people as well. I really want to understand how these play out in real life. If there's some really difficulty around medication time, okay, let's walk to the staff room, show me where the person stands, what you're doing, what's going on, to make sure it's really realistic. Because there's some situations in which a strategy sounds really good on paper, but actually in practice it doesn't work so well. Like, especially in the realm of like contingent reinforcement. Like, I'll only reinforce your behavior if you do the skill I want you to do first. And on paper, that sounds fine. But in real life, if someone's punching you and because they want you to leave them alone, you're saying, I really want you to use your words and say, leave, I need space right now. Like, how's that going to look in real life? No way. You can't, from a workplace health and safety perspective, as well as from their, rights and everything. So we try to be kind of practical about it, and then provide it, and then make sure that I'm just having that follow up. I try to attend the second half of the team meetings, if that's okay with the organization, to say, hey, how are things going? Any questions, any difficulties? So try to take that really kind of ongoing collaborative approach. Yeah, sometimes it can be difficult. The scheduling is the most difficult, honestly. I mean, how difficult has it been to get the 5 of us all together, right? Imagine a team of kind of 14 people, that's honestly the most difficult part.
Yeah, oh, absolutely it is. And I see that bit all the time.
As a support coordinator, I bet, yeah.
So at the beginning, when you're sort of describing what is in your typical behavioural support plan, you were talking about behaviours of concern and your implementation and responsibilities of that.
Yeah.
First off, do you want to explain behaviours of concern? Not that I actually like that terminology in any way, shape, or form, because it automatically has that negative condemnation. But that's not necessarily the right thinking around it, is it?
Look, from an academic perspective, everything's behavior, right? Getting your friend a cookie when you're at the shop is behavior. Murdering someone is behavior. Drinking a cup of water is behavior, right? So kind of the word behaviour in an academic sense is, again, morally neutral. But of course, in real life, that's just not how it works. And when you add of concern, immediately that kind of flies out the window, right? And so, yeah, I said I'd come back to that. The behaviours of concern part, I think, just needs really careful consideration here. And I think the balance that I have tried to find is that I will resist pathologizing behaviors that are within someone's right to do so, while also addressing all of the concerns brought to me in some way. And I promise to address it in some way. And so when there's a concern, so when a good example would be like an adult in their own home in the middle of a conflict with a support worker saying, fuck off. I'm not going to call that verbal aggression. I'm not going to put that as a behavior of concern necessarily. Still, there's a lot we need to do there, right? But I mean, adults can say stuff. And so, yeah, I think that's it. That's, that categorization of behavior of concern can accidentally kind of do a bit of damage, when we're too quick to say, oh, well, this is a behavior, getting dressed too many times in the morning before we go out is a behavior, but then technically it makes you late and you don't like being late. So I can justify that it kind of harms you. Not really, but kind of, I think it's really dicey, right? And so what I like lean into and have a bit of faith in is that, the NDIS in their first ever behaviour support plan template, the list of behaviours of concern was really like harming yourself, harming other people. And there was verbal aggression there too, which, hey, like threats and really significantly inappropriate statements can fall into. But that was kind of it. And I liked that, and especially like as a supervisor, I like that if I saw lots of different behaviors, I would say, well, hang on, how would all of those, how are you going to categorize all these? You get one other, because previously you could only have one behavior of each type. I was like, you get one other. So, I like.
Because people can't have more.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's changed now. And even now, so now the newest behaviour support plan templates from the NDIS have risks of harm. That's the section. It's risks of harm, which is quite cool, right? And so you really talk about where there's potential harm. And of course, like if there's other concerns, we've got to address those. But I just like that that's not being conceptualized.
Yeah, I really like your thinking around the impact of it rather than it just being there. Because we have a disclaimer at the start of this podcast because we use fucking in a daily context. Like,
yeah.
I'm about as boutique as a gay bogan as a gay person can get. Like I had a screen name at one point in time for a game handle as Boutique Bogan because I am ridiculously flamboyant, but God, I've got a mouth on me sometimes. And that's just normal. That's cultural context within the Australian way. Like a lot of, I think there was a survey down out recently where Brisbane comes in the third most swearing population in Australia. Actually,
Exactly.
4 of the top 5 are all in Queensland. So it would make sense that we're going to swear because it's part of what we see in our daily life, what we do in our daily life, and generally the acceptance of that has changed. So it shouldn't necessarily be, oh, he's swearing, because we just do it on our daily basis. It's probably more when it's direct targeted.
Yeah. I like you said that. I shared a story with Hannah of one time I presented at this conference and it was full of all these like behavioral people with masters and PhDs, and there was like little old me who just I don't know how I don't know why I was allowed to be honest. And it was all of these papers on like studies on like birds and dogs and stuff, and it was interesting, but like I mean pretty like academic, and I walked on to the stage with this little brown paper bag, and in it I had like like a box of condoms, a bottle of beer, a pack of cigarettes, like some slices of pizza, like, and I don't know, there was one or two other things. And I just got them out one by one. And I said, look, as adults, we can engage with all of these things basically however we want in our own lives. How many of the people, because I thought at the time that most of them would be supporting humans because I'd misunderstood. Anyway, like how many of the people we support are have the freedom to engage with these kind of things when they like really, and I think it was important. I think it's one of the only times in history where where somebody has been true, like genuine, when they've said, "No, babe, I'm going to an academic conference, not a date. The condoms are just for my presentation." um, so
Sure, that a shock around the room.
yeah, like and people, I got good feedback, but I think it's important that we kind of resist pathologizing things that are within people's rights to do. But on the flip side, if someone's come to you with a concern and say, oh, one of their behaviors is that they just too many times in the morning, or that they are like a bit rude to the support workers, or they don't want to go to their physio appointments when I really want them to, these are their behaviors, or they withdraw to their room a lot. When people come to you with these, or start randomly crying, when people come to you with these concerns, it's important to kind of listen, right? And to say, look, these are they concern you. They concern me too. Let's address them. I'm not going to call them behaviors, but let's absolutely address them. What's going on in this person's life that they are, spending a lot of their day dysregulated, or they're, not wanting to engage with supports or allied health, or they're all of any of these things. Let's talk about it, but I'm just not going to call it a behavior. And I don't know, my thinking on this has evolved over time, and it probably still will, but a really formative experience in my life was reading my behavior support plan from when I was, I don't know, 9 or something, and I probably read it around 15 or something, right? And that was a really formative experience in my life, because it has always then reminded me, like when I'm writing a plan, I'm imagining that person standing over my shoulder kind of reading it, and how does that feel for your like the thing you're interested in to be called a like obsession or a hyper fixation instead of what you're passionate about? Or how does it feel when you're like stimming, that is how you regulate when you're feeling overwhelmed, to be called distracting the other students? Like how, all of these things. I think it's important to be careful in how we talk about these things.
I know that, especially on that stimming level, I know like half this podcast recording, my legs be just going up and down and shaking left and right. And I know a couple other people that do this, and from those around it, it can be very annoying. But at the same time, it may not be controllable. For a very long time, I didn't even realize I was doing it. And depending on what my level is, it either is because I'm sitting down for too long, or it gets worse and both my legs start going on my agitation level.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's really hard when I don't really know how to navigate this right now, but what's really hard is when there's like, a family with like multiple neurodivergent people. Like, how do you meet everybody's sensory needs? If somebody is like, so speaking from pretty personal experience here, someone's really like has like auditory hypersensitivity, right? And these sounds are really dysregulating for them. But then someone else in the family is, stims really loudly to regulate themselves. Like, how do you navigate that? And I don't have like really good, specific, clear answers, but I will say that calling that kind of a thing a behavior helps no one, right? So yeah, that's my little caveat for the behavior support, sort of for the behaviors of concern section, is that if people are harming themselves or others, that's a concern, or if it's a concern to the person themselves. And so this is, I've put things in plans where, mate, I'm not going to tell you that this is a problem you need to change, but if it's something you want to work on, you're upset about, you want to work on, then I'll say that. I'll say, has identified that, when this happens, it really upsets him that XYZ happens, and he really wants to work on it. So he's identified this as a behavior of concern to him. I think that you can do things like that too. But yeah, just being careful about that section. And then the other one that I had a caveat over was the skill development section. So controversial take here. I'm nervous about that section of the behavior support plan most of the times I've read it, and the hundreds of behavior support plans I've read. And don't get me wrong, skill development is so important. We want to be supporting people to build their capacity to develop skills, to be feel safe and secure, to be themselves, and to cope in situations in which they're feeling overwhelmed. We really want to support people's skills. But the big caveat I have here is that we learn skills in the context of positive therapeutic relationships. And so if we are trying to learn skills without those really safe, secure, positive therapeutic relationships, I don't know, I haven't really seen that work very much before. And when we talk about skill building, the implication is the person's missing a skill that they need to navigate the world, right? And again, what I often see, not always, but what I've often seen is that people have the skill. It's just not working for them, right? And so they're saying, I want to go home. They've got the skill, but oh my gosh, they're supported 1 to 3, and those other 2 people have a right to community access. How do you navigate that? That's actually a little bit above my pay grade, but that's a kind of an NDIS funding situation. But to teach someone to have the skill to say, I want to go home, well, they often already do. If people are being aggressive when they want space, often they might actually be asking for it. And so to put too much into skill development is kind of implying that the problem is within the person, right? That they don't have the skills. And I mean, sometimes, of course, there's some skills that absolutely will benefit the person in navigating the world. But sometimes the skills are there. There's other things going on, especially bigger systemic kind of issues that are going on. And so, yeah, I think it's just important not to put too many eggs in one basket there. And I know that the behavior support plan kind of quality evaluation tool the NDIS is expecting us to use does put a lot of emphasis on developing those skills. And for some people, it's so important and it's so appropriate. But I don't know, I've seen a lot of situations where the person's skills are just not what's going on for that person that's resulting in this dysregulation, this conflict, this risk, So that's my,
No, I think that's really a really good point and really good insights that you've been providing there. And I'm sure there's lots more that we could go into around, especially on that implementation side, and how it can be done really well, and also the risks of it being done really poorly, or even more so around some of that RP stuff where providers might be walking into the world of unauthorized restrictive practices without actually realizing it either. There's heaps that we could go on to, but unfortunately we don't have a never-ending podcast thing. And so it's come to the point where we ask the infamous last question of it.
Yeah.
So in your ideal world, what would the NDIS look like?
Oh, that's a huge question. So I'm just gonna focus on the behavior support side of things, right? Because there's better people who can give better answers for some the broader things. I think in terms of behavior support, what I would love to see is to have a bit more room for behavior support, or the improved relationships, the category that it was, without harm, where there's not necessarily harm or risk, but people could absolute benefit from some support and guidance. And we know that people, especially girls, are often compliance is expected of them a lot more. And so there's a really significant undiagnosed, but actually often misdiagnosed, anxiety and other things like that can have a lot of internalized kind of challenges. And they're not necessarily throwing punches, but there's still a lot going on that's just regulating and internalized. Or people who, especially older adults, who have had potentially decades in really institutionalized settings. And so again, have been taught through really unpleasant ways not to act out, for want of a better term, too much. And I think that there's room there to provide, still support for people to, develop really good support teams, to support them through life, and to kind of provide that support, and actually, hey, focus on developing the skills that they identify themselves as are important to them, and so I don't know, I'd like a little bit more room for that kind of a thing, and to not need to wait for things to be escalating to where there's harm and risk necessarily to need behaviour support. And that's happening a little bit more in people's plans, especially younger people. But I think there's a lot of adults out there that, just we could support. So
Could benefit.
yeah. And also, like we talked about, Sam, at the recording, I think it would be pretty cool to have the shared baseline level of training for support staff to all understand. Because I've worked with some awesome, overwhelmingly, I work with awesome support workers who are just absolutely great. And every single support worker, the good ones, quote, and the unquote bad ones, they all have good intentions, right? Almost, barring a few really bad actors, most people have really good intentions. But man, sometimes just the casual infringements on people's rights, right, is the worry, right? Of just I know he wants girlfriend, but I don't know. Or, oh, look, I know you want some food right now, but you just had lunch. Come on, just wait till dinner time. Just the casual little infringements that chip away at that positive therapeutic relationship. That's the context in which people thrive and develop skills, is nerve-wracking. And having that some baseline training and supporting people well, and understanding differences, and then understanding this participant's rights and your responsibilities, I think would go a long way.
That's such an awesome answer. And I know we could talk for another 5 hours.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been such a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a long time coming, so I appreciate the patience and flexibility.
Anytime. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And thank you all for listening. Bye.
Huzzah!
Thank you for listening. Please share with people you know. Until next time, as the Green Brothers say, don't forget to be awesome.